we're very pleased to have Austin Green, Dr. Green, who has just completed his PhD at the University of Utah. I came across Austin through his work doing large-scale wildlife work in America with the emphasis on utilizing large data sets and new statistical techniques to make more robust inferences, things that are very widely applicable to Australian settings and around the world. So his training was as a conservation ecologist, and he's very interested in how urban mammals adapt to human influence. He's also interested in teaching and has citizen science projects, and I think some of them are attending today. He has recently become very active in an online database called Wasatch Wildlife Watch, and also leading different parts of an initiative on a global snapshot project, which is where many different researchers, wildlife researchers, conduct work all at the same time using standardized methods and contributing to a single database. So really big scale, cool projects. So we're very lucky to have him. And today his talk is entitled How Camera Traps and Community Members Make Large Scale Conservation Possible. So I'll hand it over to you, Austin. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Matthew. Yeah, so I'm super stoked to be able to talk with everybody today. This is an absolute privilege. I wish I was out there in Brisbane. I was saying that anywhere near the Sunshine Coast is a definite bucket list place for me, but I'm still stoked to be here and very, very grateful that you guys are having me out. And so like Matthew said, I just recently defended my PhD at the University of Utah, and I'm now moving into a postdoctoral fellowship with the Science Research Initiative at the UU, which is basically designed around providing undergraduate researchers with opportunities to get involved in kind of large scale conservation projects. And so it's really going to fit right into what I did as a PhD student, and I'm really excited to kind of move that forward with these large scale collaborations. So what I'll be talking more about though today is what I did as a PhD student when I started this project, Wasatch Wildlife Watch, really kind of how we designed the citizen science project, and then how we use that to answer a specific question. And then towards the end of the talk, I'll go into a little bit about the next steps in the project and kind of leveraging those large scale collaborations that Matthew was talking about. And hopefully that'll then transition really well into a nice discussion about these large scale collaborations, statistical analyses that we can use with these ever growing camera traps that are all over the place now for wildlife research. And so it's a really exciting time to be a wildlife researcher. And so, yeah, I'm super stoked to be here, and thank you very much for having me. And so to get right into it, I'm going to go and kind of return to this figure pretty often throughout the talk. And so really all it is just a rudimentary diagram of a functioning wildlife community where we have producers and decomposers kind of feeding in to all these different trophic levels. But most important with this diagram is that we have all these different arrows connecting certain species. And all these arrows mean is that in some way, shape, or form, these species are interacting with one another. This can be a positive interaction, or it can be more likely a negative interaction like competition or predation, or it can be kind of something in between where there's a trade-off of goods and bads that are going on. But at the end of the day, as a conservation ecologist, this is really the center of focus for my entire research, is understanding what these connections are, and more importantly, how these connections change as these systems are exposed to some type of environmental disturbance. And in particular, for me, that disturbance is usually human mediated. So some type of human influence that's altering these interactions, and then how does that have cascading effects throughout the entire ecosystem? And so in particular, this is a little bit more difficult for the types of studies we'd like to run, because I like to work in urban ecosystems. And so this is a picture of Salt Lake City. So this is downtown Salt Lake City, nestled right up against the Wasatch Mountains, which are really that southern tip of the Rocky Mountains. And it's this really awesome location where we have this really high density human population nestled right up against this pristine undeveloped land. And then we have just about every level of human development in between. And that's really great for an urban ecologist like myself, because most systems in this way kind of exist in this continuum of wildland to urban densities, where we have areas and it's kind of this slow transition state. And so this is really nice as a study system, but it does pose some challenges when you're an urban ecologist trying to figure out how wildlife communities work. Because instead of just being able to look at one intact community and understand what the connections are between certain species in that community, when you're looking at an urban system, you're really looking at multiple snapshots of that community as you go across that gradient of wildland to urban densities. So you really have to understand how that community changes in multiple facets as you go from one step to the next. And so just a quick example of this would be something like this, where we'd have a wildlife community that's functioning in a particular way as we go from wildlands to suburban areas, and then some type of threshold is hit where that wildlife community changes, the interactions between species change, or maybe one species is absent from the system. And so then what my research is really focusing on is figuring out what those thresholds are, and then what happens to the communities once those thresholds are hit, and how does that alter ecosystem function. So that's really, at the end of the day, what I'm focused on as a researcher is understanding where those thresholds are in these urban ecosystems, how they change across different urban ecosystems, and then what cascading effects those have on the systems that they're, these novel systems that they're creating. And so, like I said, I'm working in urban systems, and that can pose some problems when you're specifically looking at terrestrial mammals, like I am. And so we're looking at large terrestrial mammals because they're forced to navigate these urban matrices on foot. So they have to navigate all these different areas and get from place to place. But typical sampling designs for large terrestrial mammals usually aren't very conducive for an urban environment. It's very difficult to knock on someone's door and say, hey, can I live trap a mountain lion right outside your backyard and put a GPS collar on it? Or, hey, do you mind if I drive through your neighborhood at 3 a.m. in the morning and try to spotlight and to look for eye shine? Those types of methods don't really lend themselves to an urban system, especially when you're working in downtown areas. That's just going to get the cops called on you. And so what we have done in this type of project is we've initiated a camera trapping project in this area. And so camera traps, or trail cameras, as they're often called as well, are motion and heat activated cameras that we're going to take a series of photographs whenever they're triggered. And so usually when you think about camera traps, you think about really awesome photos like this coyote with the mule deer head in its mouth. But not just photos are what these things can produce. They actually are really great data generating tools. And there's a lot of really awesome highlights that they have that make them great for studying urban ecosystems. And so, some of those can be that by using camera traps, you're actually able to study a lot of rare and elusive species. And so, one of those examples in Utah is the apex predator mountain lion or puma in this particular area of the world. These are extremely rare, extremely elusive. They really like to avoid humans if at all possible. And just to give you an example, I've lived in Utah my entire life, recreated in these Wasatch Mountains where these species are very, very plentiful. And I've only seen 2 individuals. One was roadkill, and then one went by me so fast and I was so kind of freaked out by it that it could or could not have been a bobcat. I don't know. But with these camera traps since 2018, we've gotten well over 500 individual detection events of these species. And so that's just one example of the utility of camera traps to study these rare and elusive animals. On top of that, they tend to be super non-invasive. And then that's fairly relative because there's been research to show that some type of behavioral component can go into actually deploying and utilizing camera traps. But for the most part, compared to other methods, they tend to be fairly non-invasive. And that's really important when you're actually trying to study the behavior of a given species. You don't want to be altering the behavior of certain individuals with the methods you're using if you're actually focused on understanding how those behaviors change as you go across the wildland to urban interface. And so it's really important that you're using a non-invasive method like camera traps. Another really important thing for them is they offer the ability to do continuous monitoring. And so that's really important if you're looking at, like I said, behavioral changes, especially in temperate ecosystems like Utah, because that allows you to do monitoring across seasons. And so what interactions you may pick up during the summer season when resources are plentiful might be flipped on their heads in the winter when then resources are scarce. And so it's important to be able to sample across seasons so you can kind of pick up on those nuances and on those changes as the system goes through just its natural progression. And then really important, and I'm highlighting this here, is that typically cameras tend to be hardy, simple, and very easy to maintain, especially compared to most other research designs and equipment. And so that allows you to potentially expand the amount of people that are capable of actually deploying that equipment and utilizing that equipment. And so it's a really awesome thing if you're looking for large scale collaboration, because it can be done by more than just one research team. And that case and that particular note is really important when we think again about the type of systems that we're trying to study here. These urban ecosystems where we have to get this entire continuum of wildland to urban densities. It's really important that we have the sample size necessary to be able to study these systems, because theoretically, if we're looking at multiple snapshots of a community, each one of those snapshots has to have a sample size large enough to do comparisons. And so you're going to have to do really large scale work to make that happen. And just to give you an example, as an undergraduate student, before I came into PhD work, I manned a network of about 30 cameras or so and across the Wasatch Mountains. And that took just about all of my time and was only focused on one particular research area. So I knew that if I was going to enact a larger scale project with limited graduate student research funds and initiatives and resources, I knew I'd have to tap into a larger network of manpower to make this work. And I also knew that if I wanted backing for the processes I was trying to promote, that I'd have to have the whole community behind it. And so that was really the idea behind Wasatch Wildlife Watch, is let's engage as much of the community in this conservation project as possible. And so that's exactly what we did. And I say we because I partnered with a few nonprofit organizations to make this happen. But really, at the end of the day, we went out to a bunch of different organizations. These are outdoor retail stores, environmentalist groups, hunters and angler groups across the state and really across the Salt Lake Valley, and just tried to recruit people into joining this project. Basically just telling them about the importance of the wildlife in their area and really trying to just build up as much of a base as possible so that we could start facilitating and actually making this project work. And at the end of the day, we were pretty successful in establishing a really solid citizen science base. So this is just a huge shout out to them. Across the 4 years of finished surveys, we've had well over 1,000 volunteer participants contribute to the Wasatch Wildlife Watch project. And just so that you are aware of what that commitment means for each one of those 1,000 participants, it would start off with a 2-day training where they would receive in-person training on how to set up a camera, how to identify wildlife in the field, how to identify conducive spots for an actual camera, how to utilize a GPS device and navigate to those devices. And then during the second day, they'd actually have to field test all of their equipment and get it passed off by the project leads. So they have to go through that training process. And then they're actually in charge of that camera throughout the field season. So they were establishing the site, they were maintaining the site, and then the vast majority of them on the back end were then doing the initial data entry in the program as well. So it was an incredible effort to them. I hope some of them have joined the Zoom, so I can just thank them personally for all the amazing work they do. It's an incredible group. I just want to spend the next couple of slides really bragging about the effort that they've been able to produce. And so, like I said, we've started this community science project. It got started in 2018, and it's been running since every single year. And throughout that field season, we have roughly 1,000 sites established. And that is an estimate just because the 2020 and the 2021 seasons are not entirely completed yet. We're getting close, but they're not entirely uploaded yet. So we have roughly 1,000 sites, which equates to roughly 27,000 survey days. But probably most important is that also equates to roughly anywhere from 20 to 25,000 volunteer hours. And so that is just an incredible amount of time that goes in to establishing each one of these sites. And that's really probably a low estimate because it does not include the data entry that people have done as well. That's just the time in the field. And we have certain volunteers that are spending hundreds of hours in the field, hiking hundreds of miles to get to these really, really remote sites in the Wasatch. And so it's a really incredible effort. I've been really proud of just the amount of people we've been able to kind of bring to this project. And through that data set, we now have roughly 50,000 wildlife detections of 28 mammal species across 14 families and 5 orders. And so for a small scale project here in Utah, we're really, really proud of what we've been able to build from it. And so this is just a snapshot of the Salt Lake and Central Wasatch camera trap locations. So each one of these purple cameras denotes a camera that's active in the field. And then we also have an undergrad-led project from Utah State University in the Logan and Bear River Range, where they have established their own camera trap project as well. And so that's kind of where we're at with the project right now, and how the citizen science effort is going, how it was recruited. I'm going to now spend the next little bit transitioning into one particular chapter that I was able to look at with my PhD research. And that was in particular looking at behavioral responses to human influence. And so the title of the paper, you can see that right there, was we were really interested in temporal activity. So how animals use time. We were interested in whether or not human influence altered that, and whether it altered it across the entire wildlife community in the same way, or whether or not certain species reacted in different ways, altering those interactions between species. That was the main goal of the paper. And so again, like I said, we were focused in this urban ecosystem here in Salt Lake City for this particular investigation. And before I go any further, many of you guys know this, but just to kind of provide a little bit of background, occupying urban environments is typically something that people associate as being negative for wildlife in general, or negative for biodiversity in general. But for some species, it can actually be a major positive. And it really does represent a classic example of a biological trade-off, where there's both opportunities and challenges with occupying urban environments. And it's really important as urban ecologists to understand what these challenges and opportunities are so that we can build more sustainable cities moving forward. And so one of these trade-offs could be the trade-off between resource availability and habitat fragmentation. So in an urban ecosystem, resources actually tend to be fairly dense when available. And they also tend to be very consistent, especially in a temperate ecosystem like the Wasatch. The Salt Lake City area tends to have a much higher resource or NDVI reading than the surrounding Wasatch Mountains. And so if animals can utilize these resources, they have a consistent amount of them in a consistent spot year round. And so kind of imagine a raccoon at a dump site. If they can consistently use that, they can utilize that from every single year, and they don't have to move or worry about when resources are scarce. But then on the flip side of that, they have to be able to navigate this really patchworky network of resource availability. So these animals have to actually be able to navigate to these resources by occupying and moving through all these really strange built up structures. And then another potential trade-off is that if you're able to occupy an urban environment, you're going to be potentially released from the pressures of predation and competition, because you're a certain species that may be adapted to an urban environment, but you may be better adapted to that environment than your competitor. And so you're going to be released from that competition pressure. But on the flip side of that coin, you're now going to be exposed to a novel risk, and that is human-caused mortality based on these novel ecosystems. And so you really have to be able to balance that trade-off if you're going to occupy and adapt to these urban environments. And one of the ways species adapt to these environments is by altering the behavior. And in this particular investigation, we were interested in temporal behavior. So basically an animal's circadian rhythm, because it's been shown time and time again that this represents an important component of any ecological niche, and it's important to wildlife community structure. And so we really want to look at these ecosystems from a temporal point of view and notice that all of these connections that we see in this typical wildlife community, those aren't just connections through space. Those aren't just direct interactions of animals occupying the same space. That's also the ability for these species to coexist is also mediated by their ability to utilize when they're occupying these particular environments, and how and when they're actually using these particular spaces. And so it's an important component to understand these different connections and these different interactions between species. So for this particular investigation, that was the major overarching question. What are the effects of human influence on community temporal activity? And we had two major working hypotheses when we went into this. We first thought that we could have similar structures across these two areas. We're going to look at the Salt Lake Valley, we're going to look at the Wasatch Mountains, and we're going to see a similar wildlife community as we go from one of these areas to the next. That although we're going to see some type of behavioral adaptation, most of these species may adapt in the exact same way. And so the wildlife community and the interactions between them are probably going to be similar. That was the working null hypothesis. And then the alternative hypothesis was that we're going to see some type of change occurring across these two ecosystems, and these species aren't going to adapt in the exact same way. And that's going to lead to differences in species-species interactions. And so these were kind of the two things we were working with moving into this study. And so this is just a map of the study locations that we used. We denoted all of our cameras into whether or not they were Salt Lake City cameras or Wasatch cameras. And we officially used the US Forest Service boundary as the boundary separating these two study sites. But when we looked at other anthropogenic factors like human development, population density, road density, impervious surface cover, or built up structures, we saw that that was also a natural break as well between these two areas. So we felt really comfortable separating these two areas so we could make those behavioral comparisons across the two groups. And we used the first 2 years of Wasatch Wildlife Watch data for this. So 2018 and 2019, that was about 375 sites or so across about 10,000 survey days. And this is what we found. So for this first question, we were interested in how does human influence alter community-wide temporal activity patterns? We were interested in the entire wildlife community in general. How did they react? And so we adopted a novel analysis approach where we equally weighted the species that we're seeing in both the Wasatch and Salt Lake City and compared the entire community's temporal activity pattern across the two areas. And what you're looking at here in this graph is basically two clocks. So each number is a number or is an hour on the clock, and each wedge corresponds to relative amounts of activity, wildlife activity during that particular hour. And so everything I'm going to be talking about moving forward is the comparison as we go from the Wasatch to Salt Lake City. And some of the major things that we found when we looked at this were major decreases in crepuscular activity as we went from the Wasatch to Salt Lake City. So animals stopped spending as much time in the early morning and the early evening, but they increased their midnight activity or their late night activity. And strangely enough, we saw an increase in midday activity. And this was really interesting because the Salt Lake Valley during the summer, when most of this data was gathered, can get up to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which I believe is roughly like 37 degrees Celsius or so. So it's a pretty hot time of day to be active. And so when we looked more into this, what we found is that this seemed to be correlated pretty consistently with human activity patterns. And so this graph is just showing human activity. And so on the x-axis, you see time. On the y-axis, oh no. Oh, my PowerPoint just closed. I'm going to pull that back up really quick. I apologize.
No worries, no worries. At least your background isn't embarrassing. Got lucky.
Yeah, I know. And it rotates every 5 minutes. So depending on how long it takes us to pull this up. Yeah, geez, I'm sorry about that. Okay, let's fly through this really quick. Hopefully that looks a little bit better. Here we ran through it and everything. Okay, so now we're back. And so when we looked at back to human activity patterns, like I said, it seemed to be correlated with our changes in wildlife activity. So these red and green arrows actually correspond with those dips and those increases in wildlife activity. Yeah.
You're on presenter view. No, it's not a big deal, but if you can use it to, yeah, swap displays. There we go.
Okay, good. There we go. Are we back in action now? Awesome.
Yes, we're good.
All right. I am sorry about that. But yeah, so then when we looked at human activity, we saw that it directly correlated with it. And that made sense that in general, the wildlife community was responding to human activity patterns. And when human activity dropped, wildlife activity increased. And that's what we were expecting to see. But the major question we were interested in is whether or not that was consistent across all species or whether that was confined to certain species. And so we were really interested in this idea of, do species specific differences occur? And if so, how is that altering the interactions between them? So I'm just going to show one particular example here. This is a predator-prey system, coyote and mule deer in this system. And what you're looking at is a very similar graph to the human activity pattern graphs I just showed. Again, time on the x-axis, activity on the y-axis. But now we have two curves, and those curves are just basically that species activity in the Wasatch, the blue curve, and then that species activity in Salt Lake City, the black curve, and then that gray area is just where those activity overlap. And so what you can see right off the bat is that species didn't interact and didn't respond to human influence in the exact same way. And in particular, for coyote, we saw drastic increases in nocturnal activity and subsequent decreases in diurnal activity. We kind of expected this because in Salt Lake City, coyote are subject to massive amounts of human persecution. Whenever there's a documented sighting, the first thing is to actually trap, kill, and remove the animal. And so it would make sense that if coyote are adapting to these urban environments, they're going to focus on the hours of the day where humans are least active. But what was really interesting is when we looked at mule deer, we saw decreases in crepuscular activity and then this really strange increase in midday activity. And that was really strange because it created this trimodal activity curve that we knew couldn't be a response of the species in general. It had to be two different populations, because mule deer activity is typically confined by physiological constraints. And so a trimodal activity curve like this wouldn't actually be possible. So we looked more into this and tried to discern this a little bit more. And what we found when we looked at increases in diurnal activity within mule deer, it was directly related to sites and to areas where coyote were most prevalent in Salt Lake City. And so it seemed to be in direct response to coyote activity in the area. And then when we looked into the literature to see how these results kind of fit themselves into what previous research has found, we found recent investigations that showed that white-tailed deer, which are very similar to mule deer in ecology, exhibit diurnal activity patterns during fawning periods. And that we have lone adults that don't that kind of keep the typical crepuscular activity. And then during the fawning period, which is when all this data was gathered, the fawning individuals tend to be more diurnal. And so we insinuated, and this is now what we're really looking into moving forward, that this response from mule deer in response to Salt Lake City was in direct response to reducing predation of fawns in Salt Lake City from coyotes as a result of coyote activity response to human beings. And so it was a really interesting investigation. We were super excited about it, and I'm really excited to move it forward. So then to just kind of tie it all up in a bow, what were the effects that we found from these investigation? Well, in a community-wide response, we found that human beings really seemed to drive activity changes for the entire community, but we also found that species-specific changes resulted in interactions and novel interactions that we hadn't found in the more undeveloped Wasatch area. And so we really kind of went with this working hypothesis that this is what's currently occurring in the system. We have a certain system functioning in a certain way, and then we hit that threshold where we move into the more developed area. And we now kind of have a new structured wildlife community with different interactions between species. Okay, so I'm past where I wanted to be for time because it's 7:30 and we had a little bit of technical difficulties, but I wanted to spend at least 5 minutes or so talking about some of these large-scale collaborations that I'm now moving into and the next steps for my project moving forward. And so the first one is this snapshot initiative that Wasatch Wildlife Watch is really building into. And so it started off as Snapshot USA, and that's what this graphic is about. And it has really grown since then to include Europe, and then hopefully in the near future, Australia as well. But currently, Snapshot is one of the largest snapshot camera trapping projects on the planet. Every single year since 2019, anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 camera sites are established. And we have enough data from that to study and look at 80 plus mammal species across these different gradients of human disturbance. And this is just a shout out to any Wasatch Wildlife Watch participants that are on this talk. You have helped made Utah's contribution the 12th largest of the 200 plus research institutions involved. So huge shout out to you. But this project is this massive amount of data that's all built around a standardized protocol where cameras go out for the exact same amount of time across different locations during the exact same protocol and gather these massive data sets across ecoregions that we can then utilize to look at large-scale conservation projects. And so I just wanted to highlight one of them that I'm currently working on, and that is this idea that we can predict an animal's response to urbanization based on its traits and the inherent variability or plasticity within those traits. And so what you're looking at, and this project's led by Catherine Weiss at Arizona State University, but what you're looking at here is just a graph of urbanization response. And so this is based on a large-scale occupancy model where we just created an urbanization metric and then ran a model based and looked at how all of the different species that we could investigate responded to urbanization. And like we were expecting to find, it was a net negative response, but we also had both adapters and species that seemed to be neither negatively or positively affected by urbanization. And that variability then gave us the ability to do a second stage analysis by propagating the error through those urbanization response and actually use that response metric as the explanatory variable, where we then looked at whether or not species traits or the inherent plasticity within those traits could predict that urbanization response. And so these is kind of a condensed version of the results from that analysis. But what we've been able to show from this is that you can predict an animal's response to urbanization based on not only its average trait values like body mass and home range size and litter size, but also the variability or the natural variation based on the literature in those traits, within those traits, and that plasticity can be both a positive or negative predictor depending on order and depending on species. And so we're really excited for that moving forward. I'm excited to see the results of that. I'd love to talk more about this if any of you guys have thoughts on this. But then I just want to really kind of wrap up with the other organization that we're a part of, that I think is something that people out there that may be interested in joining one of these collaborations, this could be a really quick and easy step to do it, the Urban Wildlife Information Network. So UN is a network across 3 different continents and 40 different cities, specifically focused on studying urban wildlife. So these camera trap arrays are specifically tailored towards urban ecosystems. And so it's this really awesome network of camera traps across these different institutions. Again, a major shout out to the Wasatch Wildlife participants. We're the largest contributor of the 40 cities in 3 continents that contribute to this project. But this network is unique in that it has an urban, wild to urban gradient built into every single study system, and they're consistently looking for new collaborators across different locales. And so if you're interested, that project is run by Seth Magley at the Lincoln Park Zoo, and I highly recommend you reach out to him. But I just wanted to kind of perk your interest in some of the things that we can look at with some of this type of information by just highlighting one of the publications we've been working on and that I was able to help with analysis for. And that was specifically this right here, this fact that wealth and urbanization can actually be used to predict how mammals respond to different communities. And this was across different cities. And so to just kind of get right into the results, what we're looking at here is the correlation between species richness and both a city's urbanization gradient on the left side and a city's income gradient on the right side. Because what we were interested in is whether or not the makeup of a city itself can actually predict its biodiversity response. And so what you'll see on these 2 graphs is anything left of that dashed line is a net negative response, and anything right of that line is a net positive response. So for the urbanization gradient, what we found is that across the majority of cities we looked at, overall species richness decreased with increasing amounts of urbanization within the city. And this is exactly what we're expecting to find, because it's important to note all of these camera traps were along an urbanization gradient that extends from the city center all the way out to rural areas on the outlining urban sprawl. So we were expecting to see a negative response to urbanization. But then we also found this really unique positive response to a city's income gradient, or the affluence of a particular neighborhood within an actual city. And this response was not as strong as the negative response to urbanization, but it did highlight a very important environmental and social justice issue, which is this term typically referred to as the luxury effect, where based on where you live and how affluent your community is, you get or are exposed to larger, nicer green spaces and more biodiversity. And so that was just one of the investigations we've been able to look into. And it was really awesome to be able to kind of help lead this analysis, because this was a massive camera trapping project using tons and tons of Bayesian hierarchical modeling. And so it was a really interesting project to work on. And so I'm really excited to kind of bring this into my new position, where it's all about encouraging undergraduates to get involved in research and to work with large scale conservation projects. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and the many, many project partners that we have on Wasatch Wildlife Watch and the funders. And then of course, the thousands of participants, both community scientists and students that have worked on this project. And then last but definitely not least, all of you for listening. This was the only animation I had in this presentation, and we've already had a crash without an animation, so we'll see if it works or not. But I just really liked this picture of a moose kind of walking through our camera traps. But other than that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Austin. Wow, you covered a lot of ground there. Very interesting work. Really, really great to see how much your collaborations can yield really solid science.